This is Mohenraj and Rosenbaum Are Humans. Marianne Mohenraj and Benjamin Rosenbaum are here for another episode. And I asked Ben if we could talk a little bit about this pandemic, and not in a sort of like abstract, big cultural way necessarily, but more about how it's affected us individually. Because I've had a really tough time with it in ways that I didn't anticipate. Um, and I thought it might be productive for us to discuss that some. And we're experiencing it very differently, in part because Ben is in Switzerland and I'm in America. Um, but even so, or maybe especially
Yeah,
so,
yeah,
talk about that a little bit. So that's the plan for today. And I don't know, Ben, do you want to start off
sure.
talking about?
Well, I don't know. I feel like, I would say that I also had the experience that it was startlingly, more difficult than I expected. Um, I think, because as I said last time, like I'm having a very soft pandemic. I mean, given all the people who are in real physical danger or economic danger or, all the things that could be worse, like I can work from home and, Switzerland initially was hit very hard, but responded very rationally and has brought the pandemic under control. So it's not as acutely scary,
That's a
but I
great
think
point.
that,
Like from America right now, we are recording this on May 27th. The idea of brought the pandemic under control feels impossible right now. Like, it's
yeah,
literally like in America, I'm like,
yeah,
I don't know, I can't imagine America doing what needs to be done to bring it under control, which means it's very, until there's a vaccine, I can't see an endpoint to this, right?
yeah,
It's a terrifying concept. That's like,
yeah,
instead of 2 months, it's a year plus, right? 18
yeah,
months,
yeah,
2 years, right? And that's not anything I want to envision.
yeah,
So I do
yeah.
actually have to start planning for it. Like if I'm keeping my kids out of school for 2 years, what does that look like? So
Yeah.
anyway, sorry, go on. Back to what.
No, but I find yeah. So in a way, I mean, so in the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, it hit here earlier, and we were right next to Italy. I mean, right next to northern Italy. So we were the country with. I mean, it was like per capita, it was like Monaco, Iceland, Italy, and Switzerland. And Monaco and Iceland are so small that that's like noise. So I mean, really, we were like uh, per capita among the worst hit places in the world in the beginning. Um, and it was terrifying. And I think I have this I have a lot of inherited multi-generational health anxiety. That was a big theme in my family, and that's like in our marriage, it's like Esther worries about money and I worry about health. Like it's just a and I have a reflectiveness about it where I'm like, I generally know that it's irrational. You know what I mean? I'm just like, okay, well, this is the irrational fear that I have. But obviously that
Would you
didn't
say
help.
that a cultural, I mean, there's sort of like cliches and stereotypes
Yeah.
about, Jewish.
I mean, yeah, I think I do think there's a kernel of truth to those cliches, and I think it's quite interesting. I've had different opinions about that. I mean, yeah, so it's a truism if that Jews are worried about. I mean, everything is wear it in good health, and you should. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of obsession with health and digestion, and I don't know, like half of the Jewish proverbs are like, but and I think I've wondered, like, for a while, I thought that was a sublimation. You know what I mean? It's like there's so many things that are terrifying. Because when you think about Jewish history, you're thinking about violence and expulsion and the uncertainty of the relationships with the outside world and so on. And so a lot of that is like there's you're terrified of pogroms or whatever, and then like it sort of felt like it got supplement like transferred into like this is something we can like I have the sense of my father who was born as a Jewish kid in the Boston area in 1935, so like right during Hitler's rise to power. Like he was 10 when World War II ended, so that was like all of his formative years were like surrounded by the implicit message that we were all being killed and that we were helpless. You know what I mean? Like my my grandmother, who I think was constitutionally would have been suited to be like a paratrooper or something. I mean, she really wanted to do something, and she was extremely constrained by also the sexism of the time because she had been a sort of businesswoman and like fundraiser and stuff. And when he was her first child, so his birth coincided with Hitler's rise to power and begin to tear up Europe, and also with her being sent from at least being a person in the public world who had some voice to being home changing diapers and writing furious letters to the editor. So I think there is this, there's this sort of impression on him that the world is deeply unsafe, and that that it's terrifying and there's not much you could do about it. But I think that's like when you're going around feeling like they're going to murder you, but you don't. No one is overtly trying to murder you at the moment. It feels like health is an obvious place to put. Like somebody is trying to murder you, and it's a bacteria. That's who's trying to murder me. No, it makes sense. And so that's one piece of it. Yeah.
Before you go out, can I ask? Did you put? I'm trying to remember. So Ben has a role-playing game in which you're in the shuttle and there's magical threats and so on. And I've played through it a couple times now. It's a great game. Dream Apart. Sorry.
Dream Apart. Yep. Dream Apart.
Title.
Yep.
Do you have another one called Shtetl World? Am I making that up?
So Shtetl World was you are privy to the original unpublished project. So I think you play tested the original version, which was a more complicated Powered by the Apocalypse game with dreidels and everything, which was sort of an unruly beast that I may someday finish. But the origin story of Dream Apart is that I came across a game by Avery Alder in playtest form called Dream Askew that she had done as a little collaborative storytelling game of queer communities in a gradual apocalypse. And I was like, this actually maps really well as like a marginalized community surrounded by fear and a sort of half functioning outside world, and also like magic and mystery and things are going on. So I ported it, and then we ended up Kickstartering and publishing them together.
Got it.
But
all right, so I now feel that we should do an episode of the podcast that's a playthrough of Dream Apart, but
that would be great.
That would be great.
That would be awesome.
Well, let's add it to the list. But was disease one of the things in there? Because if not, I feel like it should be. Like maybe you need
there's
a pandemic.
So there is there's a bunch of, so the way that the game works is that you play people. There's characters that are divided up amongst the players, and then there's no GM, no game master in a traditional role-playing game sense. That role is divided up among people as well by theme. So different people have different elements of the setting. And so there's one of the characters that's a midwife, which is sort of has a lot to do with, who has a lot of moves and things that relate to, not just delivering babies, but like, I mean, she's really the doctor. And to health and life and saving your patient or losing your patient. And then there's a lot of and then there's, among the settings, there are things like, I think there's the varied scarcities. I'm saying that's the Dream Askew version of it. But anyway, there's the one that's like where various threats figure in some of the settings element, like plague or like things like that. But it is true that it's, what I was going to say is, when I think about this Jewish health anxiety, my initial thought is, oh, well, this is the sublimated fear, But of course, it also is true that the shtetl was this kind of overpopulated place with lots of people crammed together and like a booming population over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. And that it was a time when infectious disease was like an enormous killer. So a lot of it might not be sublimated. It might really be like a primary fear handed down,
Yeah, it's like it's history. It's cultural history. It's like knowledge, right? There's been a lot of jokes about how today we like start all our letters like we're in a Jane Austen novel. Like you're sending a work email and you start with, "I hope your family is in good health," right? So,
right.
And so that the world has changed to that, and so that anxiety is a reflection of that. It's reminded me of, so a few weeks ago, I posted a photo of my son that was a particularly like a good angle. He looked very nice in it. And my dad liked it and shared it on his own Facebook wall. Right.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I knew he'd like this photo. And I was talking to him last night, actually, and he brought it up and said, Anand looked really handsome in that photo. And then he was like, and then he said, I don't really believe in superstition, but, we're not supposed to say that, the evil eye.
Right.
It was just.
Right. Pain and horror. Wow. So that's the same thing. Like there's, like he, like.
He's
Just so he, by praising the beauty of your child, he was in danger of attracting the evil eye, like literally the evil eye, like that's what they
yeah,
call it.
yeah, that's what it's called. Yeah, yeah.
Wow,
So,
that's a remarkable degree of cultural continuity that it's all the way to Sri Lanka.
and
But
we're
is that,
against the evil eye and so on. Yeah, so there's a whole
huh?
thing. So,
And it was always called that? I mean, do you think that's a pre-Catholic, that's a Tamil thing?
I would have to go and look. I mean, Sri Lanka has a
Yeah,
big supernatural tradition. There's
yeah, sure.
demons, rakshas, and so on. And there's, you do these dances with the masks to keep the disease demon at bay. And so
Yeah,
I don't know where the evil eye phrasing came.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It may be that they picked that up from one of the colonizers and conflate. Like,
Well, but I mean, on the one hand, it might be, but on the other hand, it's actually, I mean, well, yeah, probably, but what the colonizer might have been like Alexander the Great, like, right? Because I mean, it goes back pretty. I mean, not that he
yeah,
got all the way to Sri Lanka, but he got to northern India, and then they got to Sri Lanka, because I think that the whole evil eye thing in the Jewish tradition, I mean, a lot of that stuff in the Talmud that's about like all these things you do to avoid the attention of demons, like not walking but between certain kinds of trees and not drinking things in pairs, and it's a lot of that is Persian. It's sort of it's the cultural context that they're in at that time, is they're in Persia. I mean, Iran today, because that was a big center of Jewish learning after the Romans drove them out.
okay.
And I think there's a whole, and I mean that's anyway, it's a cultural continuum. But anyway,
Anyway, no, it's a good
uh,
question. Okay. So going
so
back.
your dad would be very at home with that aspect of the shtetl.
But I would say that in general, like I did not inherit that anxiety, right? So I think
Yeah,
to bring it back to like our experience with the pandemic. So my dad
yeah,
was a doctor. My dad and my sisters are doctors, and many of my cousins are doctors. So we're all,
huh,
in some sense, very Western medicine, rationalist, etc., so on.
yeah,
Most of my family, if you go back, is either I think, or at least we have a lot of people who are either in medicine or are teachers. So we're
hmm,
invested in that framework. Um, but I think my parents' generation, as immigrants from Sri Lanka, certainly did kind of grow up with a very present sense of lots of relatives being, dealing with disease of various kinds. And this gets complicated in a couple of ways. So, one way is arranged marriage culture, right?
mm,
Because
hmm,
if you are trying to marry off your daughters, marry off
mm,
your sons,
yeah,
you have a strong investment in presenting the best possible
right,
version of your family, healthy version of your family, so that
hmm,
otherwise you might get stuck with someone who has a terrible family, right?
mm,
And so
yeah,
things that get covered up are, even something like heart disease might get covered up.
hmm,
Cancer
hmm,
gets, like it
sure.
wasn't discussed. Mental illness still is very much covered up. Uh,
Yeah, important plot point in Yentl.
yeah, so
That's why Avigdor can't marry.
yeah. So,
Anyway,
things like depression, anxiety, alcoholism, a history of wife beating, all of that gets lied
mm,
about, right?
mm,
So that
yeah,
so
sure.
that you can make a better match. And so I think that ends up, um, yeah, just affecting people's perception of health,
Hmm,
and and there's this incredible stigma. And then the other thing I was thinking
hmm,
about is how, in Sri Lanka there's a lot more intergenerational households. So
yeah,
in that sense, you may be much more aware of, like, I wonder, the diseases that come with aging and so on, right,
hmm,
are just going to be in
yeah,
your house all the time. And
yeah,
I live in an old Victorian, so
hmm,
that was built in 1885, and it has a double parlor. And my understanding is that part of the design of that, there's this little room in front that can be closed off. It has a pocket door, and it used to have folding doors that we've taken down.
wow,
Because,
yeah,
and that was a traditional Victorian design for the convalescence, because
hmm, the quarantine room.
right, because so often there would be someone who had tuberculosis or whatever else, this long
Yeah,
lingering disease that needed to be to some extent quarantined. And it's
yeah,
fascinating, like when we're somehow back in that moment. And when all of this started, one of the conversations Kevin and I had is, it feels ridiculous that we live in this big house, right? It's about 3,000 square feet, and it has 4 actual bedrooms plus 2 offices. There's only 4 of us. We don't need a dedicated guest room for the next year. And I was like, well, can we open up one of these rooms to, say, a healthcare worker who wants to quarantine from his family, and he can have his
Hmm.
own bathroom? And Kevin pointed out that, like, there's it would be because of the air conditioning and the vents and so on. Like,
Hmm.
we would have to re-engineer the house to actually make
Yeah.
it safe and quarantine. Like, in a way
Yeah.
they had no understanding of, probably, when they had the little convalescent front parlor in the front room, right? So,
Well, they also had no air conditioning, so
and
they
then,
probably really could
yeah,
shut it then.
so they could, like, just close it off and open the windows, and it would be. Um, and I'm like, when did germ theory come along? So, like,
I think by Victorian times they had a pretty reasonable understanding of it. I mean, they hadn't isolated.
they
I
had to
mean,
calculate
Pasteur is really.
cleanliness, right? So that's the Victorian sanitary bathroom.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that came out of the recognition of germ theory. And I think
Right.
Pasteur is like mid 19th century, Semmelweis and then
I'm
Pasteur.
not sure when to
So
date it.
it's,
Yeah, somewhere around there. So,
but it's yeah. I mean, they definitely already had vaccinations and stuff. I mean, by at least but sort of crude vaccinations. But
but anyway, so it just seemed it's interesting. Like, I feel like when this all came down, we had this. My personal experience of it was this incredulity, right? Like,
hmm.
I had gone to, early March, I had gone to a convention in California, and we were hearing about things, but I had just started reading the Italian doctors' reports that were sort of being
Yeah.
leaked onto Facebook and so on, right? That they were still, like, being told not to talk about it, don't spread panic. Same thing with some of the Seattle doctors, right? Where there was someone who, like, went against hospital orders to post about this. And
Hmm.
so,
Yeah.
getting this stream of information, and I had all these doctors in my family, and I was talking to some of them, but they were very much of the hospital is telling them not to talk about it, and their best practices was,
Wow.
like, panic is so dangerous.
Mm.
And people who are getting misinformation or poorly educated will engage in unsafe practices, right? Like,
Hmm.
if I don't know, I had a lot of trouble with this at the beginning. I was really kind of angry about it because
Hmm.
it felt like people who I should be able to trust were lying to the public, right?
Hmm.
That all of these
Hmm.
medical professionals, the CDC, et cetera, so on, like, all of this stuff about, say, about masks, for example, where
Hmm.
they were, and I think it did a lot of damage because the messaging kind of went out like, masks will not protect you, and the
Hmm.
reason behind that messaging was in part because we had such a shortage of N95.
Right.
And we really, and that it should have been, well, masks offer you some protection. The really effective masks we need to save for our healthcare personnel, because if they go down, we all go down, right? So
Yeah.
but they didn't, I don't know, it felt like they didn't trust the public to understand that. And
Yeah.
so, and there was research. Like, I spent a week in sort of panicked, burying myself in mask research when I got back
Hmm.
from this conference. Because in California, people were much more aware than they were in Chicago at that point, right? So,
Mm.
um,
Yeah.
people at FogCon were not hugging and were not
Hmm.
holding hands, not shaking hands, and so on, which I hadn't
Yeah.
seen in Chicago, right? So, I came back, I had a cough, I'd been through these big airports and on a plane, and I ended up teaching from home that week, even though the university had not said anything yet. I was like, I may be infected
Yeah.
and I can't risk
Right.
infecting my students, but it was a scary move at that point, because I'm like, I could get in trouble with this for this at work,
Right.
right? That I just have a cough,
Right.
I should go in and
Yeah.
teach, not teach remotely. So, um, sorry, I know this is a long thing, but I'm trying to kind of lay this mess out. And then, so I immersed myself in mask research and kind of figured
Yeah.
out, like, okay, we can get to decent 50% filtration with a cloth mask with a filter, double layer of 100% cotton. There's studies have shown that untrained individuals
Hmm.
can be at greater risk when they wear a mask, because they will constantly be readjusting the uncomfortable mask and will be touching
Mm.
their face a lot and will infect
Mm.
themselves. So there was reason why doctors who are like taught how to don and doff their protective gear
Hmm.
effectively might say like, well, we can't just tell the public to start wearing masks because they're going to put themselves at more risk. Like,
Yeah.
that's not so hard to explain to people, and it's not so hard to make a training video and put it on YouTube and be
Right.
like,
Right.
here, this is what you need to do to take care of yourself. And when I see all of the effort that people locally to me are putting into things like Cloroxing all of their groceries and whatever
Yeah.
else, I'm like, these women, these moms will absolutely watch the training video and practice before they keep
Right.
doing it perfectly.
Right. Right.
And so there's a lack of trust in the value of
Yeah.
public education. And I don't know. So I got my
I mean, that's true on the one hand. On the other hand, I also think that the skepticism about whether people would be like, "Oh, good, well, we'll leave these masks for the healthcare workers because clearly they're more important." Like, I think there's a prisoner's dilemma aspect there, where I think there are plenty of people who'd be like, "Well, I'm gonna have," yeah, I don't know.
there are. And I actually
Yeah.
unfriended someone on Facebook because he was like, "Well, I'm going to buy myself an N95 mask and
Mm.
use it." And I was like, are you kidding me? And he got very upset, and I got very upset. And so
Yeah.
this was back when there was like serious scarcity, right? And of
Yeah.
course, um, I am picturing my sister, my middle sister is a pulmonary critical care worker at Mount Sinai in New York. So she is walking into the fire every day
Yeah.
and then coming
Yeah.
home to her husband and toddler. And so the thought that people would put her at additional risk by hoarding masks made me just, I mean, I
Yeah.
really think I was a little, I try not to use the word crazy as a casual,
Pejorative.
right? Because
Uh-huh.
I try not to use it
Sure.
casually because it does carry a stigma, and it does get used as a pejorative, as a slur.
Yeah.
But I would say I was a little bit not in my rational mind
Mhm.
that first week. And I had this conversation with Kevin where I was spending all of these hours immersed in this, learning how to sew masks, ordering materials, and trying to set up a mutual aid society because I did not trust that the government was going to do everything that they should be doing to take care of people.
Hmm.
Um, and Kevin,
What does that mean? What kind of mutual aid society? What do you mean by that?
well, let's circle back to that because it
Okay.
kind of like blew up in various ways, and it's still kind of a mess. But I do want to come back to that.
Interesting.
But in that moment, Kevin kind of like saw how upset I was, and kind of came back to me, a few hours later, and it's like, look, I think this is what we should do. You go hide in the shed, work on all
Mm.
this stuff as much as you need to, and I will take
Mhm.
care of the house and the kids until
Yeah.
you know and I really needed him to do that because it
Yeah.
swallowed me for like a week or two. It's all
Mhm.
I could think of because there was so much urgency, and
Yeah.
I was furious with everybody. I was really like, like I have the smallest elected office, right? I'm on our local library board,
Uh-huh.
and it seemed like everyone around me was walking through tar. They were reacting
Yeah.
slowly to this.
Yeah.
And I was like, we need to be closing libraries. We need to be,
Mhm.
ensuring that staff are paid through this however long it goes. We need to make this clear to the public. We need to be doing things at the village level. And I was like, none of it is happening fast enough. And I went
Mhm.
to a village. It was fascinating because I went to a village meeting, and I think I sort of expected and wanted the elected officials to be much more directive than they were.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
basically said, we are here at this meeting to empower staff to do what they feel needs to be done, and
Uh-huh.
to empower our public health department to do what they feel needs to be done. And
Yeah.
I found that like super frustrating, although in retrospect, maybe that was the right thing to do because staff is paid full time to work on this and has a lot of specific knowledge about this,
Mhm.
right? Like I can
Well,
go to
they could gather the recommendations of the staff and then say this is what we're going to do. I mean, right? That would
Well, sure,
presumably
but they
you don't have to pass
mostly
the buck.
they mostly didn't do that. They mostly
Yeah.
said they mostly took it a step further and said,
Mhm.
go ahead and do what you think is best, and we'll meet again in a
Mm.
month. And they're
Yeah.
sort of like where I'm like, I think you should be more hands on in this,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it was an
Yeah.
interesting moment of like who should be making these public health decisions, right? Like
Hmm.
who's in
Well,
charge
I mean, and
of
yeah.
fixing this. And then I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to you, but I would say a lot of this comes down to I have a really strong I must save the world
Hmm.
complex in
Yeah.
some point. My psychiatrist and I will talk about
It is also very telling that you're like, of course you started a mutual aid society. Like,
it. So
and I'm not, I don't do that, but I do relate to that. That is also like you're talking about culturally. It's like there's some kind of saying, about getting scared and founding three organizations. Like that's.
yeah, so that is the thing.
This
So
is why you get along so well with shoes.
those first 2 weeks of the pandemic, I would say I was in crisis. I was not okay. I didn't really understand the extent to which I was not okay. I
Yeah.
was, and I sublimated it all into working really hard. Um,
Hmm.
some of which was on things that were beyond my capacity or weren't really like anything I had any business working on, right? Like
Mm.
other people
Yeah.
were doing it better. And this is kind of what my psychiatrist kept asking me at the time. Like when we had a conversation, she was like, why do you think you know better than everybody else what should be
Yeah.
done in this moment? And,
Yeah.
and I had to stop and be like, well, there's some reasons. I have access information that most people don't have because I have
Yeah.
friends in Italy and I'm seeing things on Facebook and I have medical
Yeah.
people in my family. And I went to the Bay Area and I was actually in Seattle before that
Hmm.
earlier in the year for another conference. So there's a reason why I do have a better handle on the situation than many of the people around me. Didn't mean I knew what to do about it, right? Like, but I
Yeah.
was seeing misinformation about masks and so on
Yeah.
across all of my community platforms online and was sort of
Yeah.
frantically trying to counter it, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
okay, I'm stopping now. That was a lot, but it sounds like
Well, no.
you did not have that kind of like
Oh,
save the world thing, or
yeah. No, I don't think I had that reaction to it. I didn't think I felt like there was very much I could specifically do. I remember that. I mean, insofar as I have small leverage, I mean, I was just thinking about the beginning of it because when you said March, that sort of was shocking because I was like, wow, March, that was a while ago. But actually, I went back and looked at the calendar, and I Purim was March 10th. Like I was thinking, oh, we must have started locking down before March because in my mind, it feels like longer. But and reading about now having read so much news and being like, oh, all these, what different countries were doing in January and February and everything. But it is true that there wasn't a lockdown here until mid-March, and I know that because March 10th was Purim, and we had like a social distancing, but not video, like an in person. Like we actually like we had a Megillah reading, and everybody sort of the chairs were like spaced apart, and some people had masks, and we were trying to like I don't know. I remember there being, but I remember like so it's a little shocking that we like the pandemic was already raging. I don't know what it was like in Switzerland then. I mean, I could look at the chart, but um, I don't think it hit full force, but it was around.
Mhm.
Certainly, there were probably more infections per day than there are now, and people are more cautious now. But it hadn't set in all the way. But I remember being like, I remember at forum being like, all right, we gotta stop doing this. And I think, I don't. It's one of these memory is unreliable. Like I want to think that I believe that I also pushed for. Should go back and look at my emails. Pushed for like, all right, we need to wrap this up. We need to move everything to Zoom. But but uh, but yeah, I think that I um was very afraid. But also I have a lot of practice treating, distancing myself from my health anxiety because it's usually irrational. So I so I feel like there's this sort of like two tracks, I'm kind of going on, and in the background of my mind there's this fog of panic, but I'm sort of like, well, there's not much I could do about that, so we'll just, in the front of my mind, I'm like, let's, do, I don't know, make dinner. And so I think I mean, I have during this pandemic taken Apple News and Twitter off my phone.
Mm.
because I was spending, an inordinate amount of time just
There was a point where
immersed in news.
yeah.
And I've sort of weaned myself from it. And I feel like in a lot of ways, it's like there's just not that much I can do. One thing that I
That's a
did,
thing to me. Like I just like that's a
uh
really common response from people, and I'm like, and
yeah,
I don't understand it. Like there's so much that you can do, and this is like the thing that is killing me is the what I had to work through was if I give myself over to everything I can do related to this, I will fall apart.
that's
Right.
very interesting.
So
I
for
mean,
me,
I mean, like, I don't know. I don't think I had the experience that you did, that there was wrong messaging around me. I feel like I mean, I'm not saying that that's not true, but of course I'm also in Switzerland, and it's a different context. I feel like, I mean, there was a period of maybe a week or two where I felt like, I mean, I don't think the Swiss didn't have the best response in the world. This Swiss
Mhm.
response has not been like South Korea or Mongolia or something, which just like smashed the pandemic. Um, but so there was a bit where I was quite skeptical, and I was like, "This is." We are dragging our feet too much. We should be having more of a total lockdown. Maybe they shouldn't even be letting people go shopping. Maybe they should Wuhan style lock everybody's doors and have mass food delivery by helicopter. Um, but as it turns out, I was wrong, and the Swiss were right. Like
Mhm.
that was the right amount of lockdown. Like the Swiss are in fact very rules abiding, and like like they published their guidelines, then they followed their guidelines, and now there have been zero infections in Basel for the last few
Wow.
days, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, like, so I don't actually feel like I was surrounded by wrong information that I needed to correct. And I mean, I don't know. Like I mean, you said there's so much I could do. I mean, sew masks and donate. Like you know what I mean? Like in a way, it's like I'm not sure. Like largely the direction that we got was stay inside. Like stay away from people. That's what I mean.
Maybe there isn't much you can do locally, right? And so, you know,
Well, I mean, we delivered groceries to the
yeah,
grandparents, and we went through the whole
yeah,
rigmarole of of
right.
of scrubbing everything and so on. I mean, it's not that there wasn't stuff to do in terms of modifying the routine, but I didn't feel like this was, I mean, there's always the sort of, I mean, there's sort of there's like
You
the political conversation, right? There's like the sort of the appalling incompetence of the Trump administration and so on.
don't-
But that's like, I feel like my lever, I mean, there's there's a diminishing returns to my posting about that, right? Like
yeah,
there's sort of
I,
like,
yeah.
yeah. Anyway,
I don't know what you should be doing or not doing. I think it's fascinating that you're, yeah, I feel like we're in the middle of a raging wildfire, and you are
yeah,
not. And
yeah,
and of course, across the world, at any given point, there are raging wildfires of different kinds, right?
sure,
And I
yeah.
don't feel the need to be, oh, there's genocide in this country. I must now give over my life to fighting that, right?
I
So
mean, one thing that's interesting about this pandemic, in contrast to other things like that, is it did feel like there was something to do. I mean, on the one hand, it wasn't. When I say there was something to do, it's like there wasn't. I think you had this urge to fill your day with like activities that you could, if you only had enough time, you could
no,
draft five more letters or issue three more proclamations, and it would make more difference. I mean, I don't have that, but but it is interesting that in some ways it was like this was an exemplary crisis where it feels like, and again, I'm sort of looking at this, the mood has shifted here. So it's very,
yeah,
I think I was mired in panic, and now I sort of feel like, well, that worked so far. I mean, it could always come back, but like, more and more, it feels like, well, I guess that worked. And it does feel like there's so many things like global warming, the, I'm always trying to eat vegan, and I don't have a car, and we have a small apartment. You know what I mean? Like, I've chipped away at the problem, but obviously my carbon footprint is still bigger than it should be, and the problem is immense and
yeah,
epic and decades long. And like, this is a crisis where it's like the thing is, you just need to get R below 1,
right.
right? and it dies. And so like there was like very clear marching instructions for each individual: stay inside and wash your hands. It's sort of like the kindergarten version of a crisis. You know what I mean? It was like, stay inside, wash your hands. And that, so and you know, by and large, like, humanity is doing a pretty good job. Like, if you look up a curve of the crisis on the whole world, I mean, part of the problem is, of course, that may not be true because it's moved from countries that have more testing to countries that have less testing. So it may be worse than we think. But, you know, there's a way in which certainly lots of,
Humanity did a good job at a short-term thing, right? Like,
yeah,
so so that's, I think, what was great about this disease and this whole thing is that if you did it right, if you washed your hands and stayed inside,
mhm,
then within 2 months you can
yeah,
get to it being mostly done, right?
yeah.
But in
That's
America,
what I mean. It's what I mean about it being a kindergarten level crisis. It's like climate change requires us to do large, long term things with great uncertainty, with enormous risks in the balance that are unclear, and so we have to take global collective action. This was like locally matters. So if you don't go outside of your house, you won't infect your neighbors. It was local. It was the time scale was weeks and months, and the activities were like, and also there's a certain amount of satisficing. Like, if you've washed your hands and you're staying inside, there's a sense in which with climate change, you know, we're already practically vegan, no car, small apartment. I don't know. It still feels like I'm way over the line. Like, I didn't even know what it would take to bring me back to where my resource consumption was one
well,
Earth.
I think the research is pretty clear that it's not actually little individual, like,
Right. Right.
the
And that's another thing. It's not right, exactly. But but
you actually
but
can't do it, like,
which is to some extent also true of the pandemic, that it does require collective action, right? But
right.
I mean, it does require the state to do something. I don't know. I mean, it's a mix. There's some individual and some. That's not a hard line. But I guess what I'm saying is, it's like, one of the nice things about it was, I did actually have the feeling that if I did and the messaging was that if I did these relatively simple things, that would be enough. And they twiddled it. You know, it was at some point, Switzerland was not like, I mean, Switzerland still has not gotten to the point to be like everyone should wear a mask, which, you know, the East Asian countries are doing, and is sensible. But like, you know what I mean? It's sort of like not only was it local and short in terms of time scale, it was also like somebody was telling you, do this and it will be enough. And that is a tremendous, like, tremendously motivating,
Right.
you know,
And
uh,
I think that's so where we are now has to sort of jump to, I asked Ben before we started this whether he'd read a piece that I just wrote called Three Fights, which is and he had, which is great. It's just like a page long thing about my husband's and my different reactions to risk assessment during this and
mhm,
behavior
yeah.
practices, right? And I think what's happening now in America is that it's gotten much, much harder over
Mhm,
the 2 months. The stay inside and wash your hands
mhm.
thing has gotten
Yeah.
much harder for a variety of reasons. One of which is that it is so expensive in America to keep businesses shuttered month
Mhm,
to month to month for a
mhm,
host of historical reasons that there's a lot of pressure on governments to stop, giving people stimulus checks and unemployment and instead reopen businesses, whether it's safe or not,
yeah.
because they don't feel like they can afford to keep them closed. And if they don't keep giving people money to stay home, essentially, then
Mhm,
people will start to starve, right? Like, and
yeah.
literally, they will run out of food. And so
Yeah.
you're going to start getting deaths from the other side of this. And I think
Yeah.
I have a little bit of a hard time sometimes with I live in Oak Park, which is a very, it's pretty educated area, lots of people with secondary degrees, just outside Chicago. And the messaging in Oak Park has been very much in line with sort of the CDC cautions
Mhm,
um, and like we shut down before Chicago did and
mhm,
so on. So that's all great, but it's playing out in a very hardline reactionary messaging of, fury, you see a lot of online fury at people who break the rules, right, in a
Hmm.
variety
Hmm.
of ways. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that's problematic, I guess. Like I think I think we should acknowledge that there are people who, if you just all stay home, um, they're going to be damaged in a whole host of ways, right? Like
Hmm.
this is not like we do in fact to some extent have to reopen somewhat, right? Does that make sense?
Well, I think that, I mean, I think in a way, I mean, looking at it from the perspective of Switzerland, it's like this is this one of these weird magical things about like collective action and exponential curves. Like essentially, some countries never locked down. You
Right,
know, like Taiwan is next to China, has like 400,000 citizens or something, like, commuting to and from China, and they never locked down. They had the least pain, even though they had the most risk, because they did such aggressive testing and tracing and all of this stuff. They were ready. So there's this way in which like a little bit of preparation beforehand, like having enough test reagents, makes this enormous
right,
difference later. And there's also this way in which it's like it's not that hard to get people to stay in for a month. It's a whole other thing to get them in to stay in for a year. And if you have, it's like R is the R being below or above 1 is like this brutal master, where it's like if a certain percentage of your people, if you issue the same proclamation
yeah,
of what to do, wash your hands, stay inside, do this and that, these are the people who can go out, these are the kind of businesses that can stay open. And like, I don't know, it could be that if you have like 80% compliance, you're done in 2 weeks. And if you have 76% in compliance, you're still in a pandemic. You know what I mean? And so it's actually not everyone is complying in Switzerland. It's just enough people are complying that R is under 1. And so it becomes this very weird, and at some point it's maybe like, because of course there is harm on the other side. There is real harm. I mean, it's a terribly brutal thing that you can't just, I mean, it is a horror. It does have horrifying ripple effects to just keep everything shut forever.
violence is going up and child abuse is going up, and um,
Yeah.
all the women who are being driven out of the workplace as a result of this because of no childcare,
Yeah.
um, people who are having dealing with depression, etc. I mean, it's just there is a host of consequences to shutting down, and I get frustrated with how it feels very simplistic sometimes. The people who are like, you know, everyone should just follow the rules and stay home, and I was like, like what if you are the and I think I have a slightly different perspective of this, in part because I have a lot of students who are kids of color, and as at the end of the semester, I gave them the option instead of writing final papers, traditional final papers, writing instead about how COVID's affected their lives, and so I got to hear about things, and I have everything from the student who had five in March, he had five relatives in New Orleans who had died of it already, right? So it's
Yeah.
hitting the Black community very hard. Um, I saw a stat. I think 1 in 2,000 Black Americans have died now of COVID, which
Wow.
is just horrific, right? And
Yeah.
then but I also have the student who is like, my dad was laid off. I'm the only, I lost my job. I had to find another job that's now a high
Hmm.
risk job at a
Yeah.
grocery store because I am the
Right.
only support for the family right
That's the
now.
only jobs we have is the.
She's 19 and she's supporting the entire family at this high
Yeah.
risk job. And her dad has a health condition, so he has to go to the hospital for treatments every couple of weeks, chemo or something like that. And so she has to like go out and work, be in a high risk area, come back to her immunocompromised father, take him to the hospital in the middle of
Hmm.
all of this, and is
Yeah.
also like trying to do education for her younger siblings, right? I mean,
Yeah.
she's the one
Wow.
doing that,
And go to school because she's your student.
and going to school because she's my student. And so
Yeah. The
I don't know.
disproportionality is
I think
immense.
some of the people around me, Park, maybe don't have quite an understanding of how difficult it is for
Hmm.
people to comply,
Sure,
right? Like
sure.
the payment
And
of
that's, I mean, and you see that even more extremely. I mean, I want to get back to our emotions and so on, but just as another, like, I read this on the news bit, you see this more extremely in like in even poorer countries where really there's like an elite that can isolate. There was some reportage from I don't know, Rough Translation or Radio Lab or one of those podcasts where essentially a reporter was going out in Pakistan to talk to people who were like congregating in the you know, congregating in poor people congregating in groups essentially to beg, although they were not usually beggars. Usually they were building trades people, but they came to like look for food. And when she came, they all made a social distance circle around her. Like they all knew the guideline and they all complied with it regarding her, not with regarding each other, because they knew she was a rich person. So they didn't want to infect her. They had no other option. Like they live the slum they live in, there's literally no way they could be 6 feet apart from each other at all times. It's absurd. But like they were considerate enough to be like, oh, a rich person, we better step 6 feet back because she probably lives in a house where that's possible.
that's that's amazing and appalling. I'm also
Right?
I have a writer friend in my local workshop, Dan Gillock, and his day job is as a union organizer. And so at the last workshop, we're having our writing workshops via Zoom now. But he was talking about how he works with a lot of people who they work the factory line in food production, and they work
Yeah.
shoulder to shoulder, and
Yeah.
like all
Yeah.
day long, and these are the people who are like touching our food,
Yep.
right? It's like
Yep.
there's some like complete
Meat production, apparently, like most of the super spreader events, or some large proportion of the super spreader events in America, have been like meat processing lines, which are
and
completely like
in
shoulder
fact,
to shoulder.
you would think should be able to like retool for social distancing, but it would cost them a lot of money to do that, and
And they have these very thin margins, and the workers are very. I mean, it's, the whole
so
system is.
they end up laying off 2/3 of their population of their staff so that they can social distance the rest and slow the machines down. I mean, it would. So it's not an easy problem, but I
And
really do.
that's sort of shades of Upton Sinclair. I mean, that particular industry has been this brutally inhuman thing in America since, it
Since
sort of never,
right, as documented in the jungle,
since the
right?
Gilded Age.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but to take it back to like I don't know, like it's easy to be a little scandalized, and I mean I sort of think we should be scandalized and angry about that, but at the same time, um, I feel the pressure to break protocol, right? And
Hmm.
maybe you don't. So like the tension between me and Kevin has been,
Uh-huh.
he would happily just stay in for a year
Yeah.
with me and the kids and not have a lot of trouble with it. And
Yeah.
I am looking for good reasons to leave the house. And
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not finding them for the most part, right? But like, it was garden season while all this started. This is like normally I'd be going out to nurseries and buying a lot of plants and putting them in the ground, and I went out twice, and both times I felt fairly guilty, even though it
Mhm.
was a very low risk activity in the
Yeah.
sense that like the stores are mostly big empty spaces. It's you and a lot of plants. There's like one interaction with the cashier, right? So like
Hmm.
so that's okay, except it is still an unnecessary risk, right? And
Yeah.
there was another time when I don't know, like I wanted to bake something and I didn't have sugar or flour or something, and I went to the store and I didn't have
Hmm.
to. I could have
Yeah.
not made the thing, but I'd been wanting to make the thing for weeks, and like somehow, and we hadn't been able to get grocery deliveries. We had plenty of food to live on,
Hmm.
right? But the
Yeah.
Amazon was backed up and Instacart was backed up, and there was a couple weeks where it was you had to like be on at midnight to try and like catch them opening up the next wave of deliveries, right? So not an issue anymore. The supply chain is fixed, but at that point, and I just went, and I knew he would not be happy about it, and I
Yeah.
knew it was a risk, but I'd kind of hit a limit, and I feel like
Yeah.
now we're at this place where everyone is doing their personal risk evaluations. We're
Hmm.
applying peer pressure to each other as we should
Hmm.
about it, and we're like looking around at what everybody else is doing to try and figure out what's okay. And
Hmm.
so you know,
Yeah.
I end up feeling like, there's no one in my house who's immunocompromised. We're not in contact with any elderly people. Kevin and I are just around 50. The kids are healthy. Um, there's we are in a relatively low risk situation. And if we took small risks like going out to a campground for a week,
Hmm.
uh, it probably wouldn't affect us that much, right? Odds
Hmm.
are we'd be fine.
Yeah.
But there's the performative aspect of it matters. If people see us doing that, they will feel emboldened to do it as well, right?
Right, and I mean, it's one of those roll the dice. So there's a very small chance one of you would, in fact, just happen to hit the virus wrong, so that you ended up in the hospital, and then you'd be putting the healthcare workers at risk, right? So
Everything's a roll of dice
what's
generally.
that?
Everything's a
Huh?
roll of dice
Yeah,
generally.
sure,
Like
sure.
we're constantly engaging in
Right,
risk
right.
mitigating
Yeah,
in that, which is part of
yep, yeah,
the you know sorry, I don't know how to phrase that. Like that's part of the
yeah,
district.
yeah.
And when I hear the people who at the beginning of this were like, but we don't shut down for the flu, right?
Uh-huh.
That's they're not wrong except in the specifics, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a reason
Hmm.
why the exponential growth of the coronavirus makes it different than the flu,
Right.
right?
Yeah, it's too. I mean, well, yeah, because humanity has no immunity to this thing. It's novel, and so it's 2 weeks from no, stop making a big deal. It's just the flu to like mass graves in rich cities, right? I mean, but and then it can go the other way. Like it's very labile. That's the weird thing about it. But I wanted to respond to the emotional point because it is funny. You're like you don't think I have this. I actually kind of have the opposite thing. Um, so I mean, because and our experience has been very different. So and I also think it'd be good to talk about. I mean, touching on your three fights, I think it's worth talking about my fights. So so I have all this. I mean, I there's this anxiety in me, which is like this untapped, which I skate on the surface of and like doesn't show, but it's like this vast reservoir. And so Esther has been seeing. Also, we have been isolating less just by the virtue of the Switzerland is. I haven't had to suffer the same intense isolation that you're talking about because we've kind of had to go out. Like small apartment. We share our backyard, our little garden backyard, and like there's is on some level food delivery, I guess. But one thing that happened in this pandemic is that Esther's parents, who are, you know, definitely high risk and should not be going outside, like Esther was sort of probability gaming like the risk that they would get fed up with staying inside and go to the store themselves. And like the best thing that we could do about that was to get them whatever they needed by doing day. So we were shopping every day because like Esther would call them and reassure them that it was totally okay and cajole her mom into admitting that she'd like Parmesan cheese, like whatever, or like
My
croissant spread.
we ordered delivery for my parents for similar reasons, but yeah.
Yeah. But I
Uh,
mean, it was definitely like it was not like I mean, Esther's position. I have no way of knowing this is the case, but I trust her. Is that if they had to, have a more limited selection and wait a few days for it to be delivered and so on and so forth, like they would just be like, oh, this is silly and go get it. So I was always and for a while, see, Esther was also still seeing patients because she's a psychotherapist and she's essentially a critical worker. There's a lot of people for whom this pandemic was super triggering and like caused them to relapse in substance abuse or to be at risk for suicide or whatever. So, we just made a decision she was going to keep seeing a lot of her patients, not all of her patients. Some of her patients, she was like, "This is not critical enough. We're going to move this to Zoom or take a break." But a lot of them she still saw, and she, with a whole rigmarole of hand wash, they wash their hands, and then she washes their hands. The chairs are on opposite sides of the room or whatever. But like, it's important for them to,
and we needed to do it in person, so that like all the psych people I know switched to telehealth, so that
yeah,
didn't
but
happen there. No.
well, I mean, I don't know if it happened, but there were a lot of people. I mean, she made case by case determinations. So some of the people who were young and comfortable with the internet and it wasn't so acute, she was like, let's just do Zoom. And some of the people are like who are older or who are in more crisis, they just weren't going to get that much over the. Oh, it wasn't going to make the difference for them, and it's COVID's not the only thing you could die of, right? So like it's one of those trade-offs. Like if they're really at risk for sinking into and also they're more at risk for COVID if they get hospitalized for a depression than if they're just seeing coming to Esther's office. So she was in a way it's like we weren't that locked down, and for a while Esther had to go to her office to see patients, and because she was seeing patients, some of whom were old, we basically decided. I mean, I initially was like I should be the one to go shopping
Right.
because and we should wash our hands and do everything we can at home because she's more at risk of transmitting it to the patients. So I was for the whole first part of the pandemic when it was intense, I was going shopping, and it was this, I mean, that was a very, I mean, I was going shopping every day, and I was like suited up. I don't know, just like kind of, with a scarf around my, I didn't really have a proper mask, but like, like, and then I would get home and disinfect everything and take things out of packages, and I'm mostly in the backyard before going into the house, and I had this super high level of anxiety about it. I mean, it was sort of an ordeal. So it's kind of the opposite, where you're yearning to go outside. I was like, oh my god.
Which is the fact that I have like no personal fear around disease, so like, which
Yeah,
is
yeah,
really weird. So finish
yeah.
what you're saying, and then we can come back.
I mean, and I was afraid of getting the disease. I was afraid of being a vector. I mean, I was more afraid of like, and of course, like, sure, my, we control who we see and everything. But again, it's possible for Esther to give it to her patients, even with all the rigmarole she goes through disinfecting every surface and whatever. And also the kids. And, it's something where, it's like both my kids are, my kids would probably survive COVID, but some young
No,
people have bad reactions to it.
there's some, and I want to say like part
Yeah,
of what Kevin and I have been talking about is that we are seeing more and more evidence of there being some long-term health risks to children
yeah, yeah.
from that So for anyone who's listening, if you haven't run across that, you should take a look at that research. But
And one thing that's not a very, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, isn't a super um, significant, uh, like it doesn't measure up to death, but just in terms of like where my anxiety lives and how it expresses itself, and like how we get stuck on things that are vivid rather
mhm.
than things that are necessarily important. But it's also important. Both of my kids are singers, particularly Aviva, who's like majored in music and is a real vocalist, and like, even if they just get ventilated, like even if they end up being fine, but they were tubed, like that's, that, I mean, like just the idea that she couldn't sing anymore like she used to, you know what I mean? Like, anyway, so I have all this running through my head, and I'm going to the store every day. And so, rather than building up a craving for to get out into the world, like I was like, home definitely felt like a refuge. And then, it was very exhausting and confusing to be at home and in front of the same screen and cooped up in the house. And I did have to figure out how to, find different spaces like the garden, like go to the backyard for writing or whatever. But in a lot of ways, it was like I was, once I could throw all my clothes in the hamper and shower and detox from being outside, I felt like I had, you know, retreated to my haven. You know what I mean? And like, if I could then just, and I started being pretty easy on myself in terms of what I got done in terms of day job work and writing and everything. Actually, writing picked up. In the beginning, I couldn't write at all. I was far too much in a fog of panic. But I managed, it's sort of, I worked it out to where now I think I've been pretty productive over the last few weeks. But I don't know, just playing board games with Noah in the attic and singing with Aviva, it just felt like this refuge where the world outside was a terrifying storm. And now, so just to finish the contrast, now it's funny because now the message outside is things are opening up, and it's like the barbers are open. I could get a haircut, and this is like all these things are open now, and I am still internally like sort of like, what the hell are you people all doing? You know what I mean? Like, why are you going out? It's not, we
There
don't
was
have a vaccine yet.
a podcast I was listening to that I think it was somewhere in Staying In with Emily and Camille, where Emily's a therapist and or has been a therapist, is a writer now, but she was talking about how people are likely to develop agoraphobia as a result of
Mm,
it, right?
yeah,
Which
yeah,
I think is fascinating, right? Like
yeah,
it's completely the opposite of my experience, but I could see it in Kevin, like, and
yeah,
I see it actually a lot in the on the again the community discussion boards where there are people talking about how they're too anxious to go to the grocery store.
yeah,
People are not
yeah,
observing the rules. People are like, and they feel like they're running a gauntlet when they
yeah,
go and
yeah,
come back.
yeah. That's completely
Uh,
how I feel.
and that's so I don't have any of that, and I think I feel like there may be something wrong with me, but
Well, or you're a superhero. That's also possible.
but
You do have a certain air of invulnerability.
yeah, and that, it's one of those things like, teenagers are like that. They don't
Yeah,
like feel
yeah.
like they die, and that a lot of that has to do with the teenage brain. And by the time you're 25, you've kind of
That,
settled down.
that's a different podcast about the teenage brain. I'm a deep skeptic.
Oh,
We'll
yeah?
schedule that episode.
So I'll be
Yes.
curious. But I don't know. I don't know anything really about this. My daughter just turned 13, so I got to start learning about it. But
There's a lot to say on that. Another
okay,
episode.
another episode. But uh, I will say, my so a couple of things. One is all of my grandparents died in their 60s,
Yeah.
which is pretty young. My great grandmother, at least one of them, lived to be over 100.
Hmm.
So it's not
Hmm.
like there's no long lived genes in the family.
Hmm.
But I think I've always had a little bit of a sense of I might not make it past 60. And
Wow.
so, which has not been upsetting or worrying. It's just given me like a timeline
I mean,
of,
I'm worried now.
you
That
know,
shows you how differently we
this is
work.
my timeline. And so, like, I
Yeah.
think since from high school on, I have tried to, if you'd asked me in high school, I would have said this, that I try to live my life as if I might be hit by a bus tomorrow, right? And
Hmm.
so I tend not to put things off. I tend to be a little bit of an experience junkie and
Hmm.
including things that are risky experiences. I'll give you an example that was sort of a funny thing. I was in college. I was visiting Edinburgh. I was on my own for a few days, staying with sort of friends of friends.
Hmm.
And I went out to a pub, met a guy who was hitting on me in a kind of like mild way, whatever. And he asked if I wanted to go up King Arthur's Seat on his motorcycle.
Uh-huh.
And which you're not supposed to do at night, but he was like, up there. And I said, well, that'll be cool. And if my dad is listening to this, I don't think I've ever told him this story. um, so I said, sure, right? And so I got on the back of his motorcycle. We went up, and it's, King Arthur's Seat is like this hill in Edinburgh. And you have this amazing view of the bay at night, the Firth of Forth, right? And we got partway up and it got too steep, so the motorcycle, we were going very slow. Motorcycle kind of fell over. So then we got off and like found a bench and sat down. And then he turned and he grabbed me by the shoulders and he shook me and he said, I want you to promise me you are never going to do anything this stupid again.
Weirdly sudden protective moment.
It was the funniest thing. It was like
You
this.
said no.
I think he like tried to kiss me, and I said no, and I don't know,
Yeah.
like it would have gone bad, and
Uh-huh.
I had a good feeling about him, and clearly I was right because look what a sweet guy he was. But but it was this. So I'm maybe not great at estimating risk, right?
Or maybe you are.
Or maybe I am, or at least where other people are involved. But and I'll add one more thing to all of this is a thing happened when I was 12. I was supposed to go to Sri Lanka for the summer, and my parents got a telegram saying, "Trouble's coming, don't send her." I was supposed to
Yeah,
go
I
out and
remember.
stay with my grandparents, right? And they didn't send me. Black July happened. Thousands of Tamils were massacred in the streets. I knew
Yeah.
people who narrowly escaped death. So uh, so I was talking about this with my shrink at one point, and she said, there's this thing where people who have escaped death once
Hmm.
um, uh, feel freed from societal constraints after that.
Hmm.
They're like, I could have died,
Hmm.
therefore I get to do whatever I want now. And she was
Yeah.
sort of postulating that this is why I felt free to like write about sex in my 20s and date white boys and whatever, all the stuff that like
Mhm.
other good Sri Lankan American girls didn't do is because
You had
that,
been spared.
that yeah, I'd been spared. And she connected it actually to like the Holocaust and
Mm. Hmm.
uh, that it's a kind of a not survivor's guilt, but
Hmm.
I don't know what the term would be, survivor
It would be
freedom,
survivor's license.
survivor's license, something like that. Like, I didn't die, so therefore, and even though like, uh, I've had life threatening things. I had breast cancer. I went through a year of treatment.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think I still mostly on some fundamental level. Like either I don't believe I can die, or it's okay if I do die.
Mm.
Like I
Yeah.
don't. It doesn't tend to shape my actions. So that actually makes it particularly difficult being obedient right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yeah.
I am not personally scared about my
Yeah.
risk of catching COVID by going to the grocery store or anywhere, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, people wouldn't walk into a plague ward, right?
Yeah.
But aside from that, I'm not
Well, you
worried.
might.
What?
Well, you might.
Well, one of my first reactions to all of this when I heard that the ventilators weren't working was, well, can I be trained to do manual ventilation? I could volunteer,
Yeah.
right? And my doctor friend was like, God, I hope we don't come to that, right? So
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
worry about it yet. Um, but but it is like my instinct is to put myself in the fire, right? So
Yeah.
and that was also part of my frustration that I knew so many people who were walking into the fire and I was not qualified to do so, right?
Right.
So
Right. Yeah.
so um, anyway, that's where I am right now. Where the main thing holding me back from
Hmm.
breaking the rules is thinking about other people's risk. Thinking
Hmm.
about, well, if I do get sick, that's going to be harder for healthcare workers who will have another person to take care of,
Yeah.
or maybe I'll be taking a ventilator away from somebody else, or whatever it is, right? But
Yeah, and there is this mystical thing about the number where it's just like if you're, we get R under zero, like everybody who doesn't get sick just chips
right.
away at that thing, and it can go down as swiftly as it went up. You know what I mean? That's the other side of the exponential
Feel
curve.
the reality of that here in Chicago. I mean, even though we're supposedly past peak now,
Yeah,
or we're on the downswing, it seems
yeah,
very unclear. And it's
yeah,
like we're opening up, and I'm like, really? Is it time to open up already?
yeah,
We're
yeah,
just past peak, right?
yeah,
Illinois
yeah.
has hit all of their like. There's like 4 categories, and we're green on all of them. So I guess I understand why Pritzker is opening up, and
Hmm.
yet it doesn't
Yeah,
feel like
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Well,
I'm just,
yeah, I didn't look at your numbers, but it is where I go and look at the numbers in Basel just to reassure myself because it is
Illinois is
there's
okay,
this,
but we have Wisconsin and Indiana right next to us who are not okay,
yeah,
right?
right,
And
right.
so,
And you can't close your borders, right?
right.
That's another big difference is American states can't close their borders. I was going to say two things about talking about the psychology and also our fights and
Yeah,
my two more
go.
things on that. Uh, so the end of the other half of the grocery story is that I was going all the time, and then at some point we uh, we shifted that. At some point, the risk was low enough that Esther and I had a conversation where we were like, okay, at this point, I think because for a while she was, I was the only one going,
Mhm.
and then at some point she was like, this takes so much out of you. And at some point we're like, the risk at this point, the actual risk of getting COVID by going to the grocery store is lower than the psychological toll. So it's like that it stresses me out more. I mean, that was pretty far down the curve. But I mean, now we kind of both go. But depending. But and then the thing that's interesting, I mean, I was trying to think what my version of the three fights would be, but I think that honestly, the main thing that I didn't remember what we fought about, but I remember that mainly we fought about me being grouchy. But I remember this, you know what I mean? Like I was sort of, I don't know, mean or angry or regressing. But the thing that was the insight when we like took our walk and talked about our fight or whatever was that like it's interesting that her world in some sense, I may have said this before, didn't shift that much. Like there were a lot of things where, like whereas I felt like a lot of my supports had suddenly been removed. A lot of the things that a lot of the things that sort of replaced online, did I don't know, like synagogue online. I mean, it was okay, it was nice, but it was like not, for both synagogue and other thing like WisCon. It was like it just made me feel the acute absence. You know what I mean? I just it was it was a hard weekend because I liked doing a talk at WisCon. The Discord was nice. They did their best they could, but just like for me, the overwhelming feeling of not actually being there was
Horribly
so
sad.
swamped. as much as some things were nice, but like the massive undertone was not being there. And the other thing is that a thing that I sort of rely on psychologically is just going to America. This is the biggest part of my carbon footprint that I find difficult to reduce is that like I am a reluctant expatriate. Like I am, as much as I've lived here for a long time and I've integrated and I speak Swiss German and I belong to various clubs and have done everything a good little immigrant should do to become integrated into Swiss society. Like it's a lifeline for me to go back to America where people get my jokes and I fluently understand everything without having to think hard. And I just and even the I've said before, like homesickness is a very big part of my life, and like even the things I don't like about America I miss. You know what I mean? Like I miss 7-Eleven, and 7-Eleven is terrible. Like fluorescent lights and packaged, like, highly processed foods. It's a terrible place, but I miss 7-Eleven, because that's, it's
When I visited Switzerland, I was there for a couple of weeks, and
yeah,
by the first week or two, I was like all about the cheese and the chocolate. And so, like the third week, I went to Starbucks. I was
right,
like,
exactly. It's like,
I had to walk into a Starbucks and like have a little bit of fun, right?
yeah, yeah, there's something, and Switzerland is super nice, but there's something in a way a little suffocating about it. The Swiss are very good at forming consensus, and so there's a very strong norm, and I am often outside it. So I don't know. So it was like just the hard one of the hardest things has been that I can't leave this country. As much as I appreciate this country, and it's a great place to weather the pandemic because it's doing a great job because the Swiss are so law-abiding and sensible. I also emotionally sort of depend on getting the hell out of here at least a couple times a year. And there's not, and there's not going to be Wisconsin. You and I are not taking a road trip across the country in summer. So it. What's that?
Maybe next summer.
Yes, maybe next summer. I mean, maybe maybe America will have recovered enough by fall that like so we moved the launch of my book to Halloween because
Yeah.
maybe I'll go to World Fantasy, but but it's definitely that is and even within Europe, I mean, the Villa Diodati is a writer's workshop that gets together a couple times a year, and that's not how. I mean, so there's like this, and all the basketball and synagogue, like all of the sort of things I do that keep me sane are a little, are somewhat locked down. And I think the main effect of that is just that I'm sad on top of being scared and like frayed, like a little bit reduced. And what really and after having snapped at Esther and us having a fight and a walk and figuring all this out, like I've just tried to like be gentle with myself and be like, I am at reduced capacity. Like there is only so much. I do not have the usual supports, so I'm just managing to do a certain percentage every day of what I would otherwise.
I think about a month in, that was when I finally like acknowledged that I was not okay, right? And
Yeah,
that it was all right that I was not okay.
yeah,
That it's a
yeah.
global disaster. It's okay to not be okay. You don't
Right.
have to be hyper competent in the middle of a global. I mean, except I was like, well, it's a global disaster. That's when I most need to be hyper competent. It does not necessarily match my capacity, right? Like,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
am a human being. Look, Mohan Raj is a human, and there are some things that keep me sane and healthy. And one of the things is contact with others. Like so, that day when I went to go visit my doctor friend in the garden, and we went for a somewhat socially distanced walk. And I'll pause and point out that I think she, because of her job and because she does have to constantly go back in and interact with patients and so
hmm
on, I think she almost doesn't feel the need for the acute social distancing in the same
yeah,
way as
yeah,
those of us who just like hunkered down in our homes because
uh-huh,
she hasn't been able to do that, right? And
yeah,
so
yeah.
even if she has an intellectual commitment to it, she doesn't have the emotional
Habits. Yeah.
commitment. And it's funny, like a couple of doctors I've talked to have sort of I've seen them be upset about feeling like people are avoiding them, like they're plague carriers or something, because they're
Yeah,
like pulling away from them.
yeah,
And I'm not sure that's really what's happening. I think it's
yeah.
more like we're pulling away from each other. All of
Right.
us are like trying to actively social distance,
Yeah,
and they haven't been doing that because they have to be up close and personal with their patients and their
yeah.
staff and so on. So. I don't know. So anyway, that's a big side note. But when I went to go see her, after like a half an hour of that, I felt better, even though we'd been talking on the phone, even
Hmm.
though we'd been talking on
Hmm.
Zoom, or we haven't
Yeah,
been talking on Zoom. But if we had been, like, the in personness really helps me in a way that I
yeah,
think Kevin doesn't feel nearly as much,
yeah,
right? So he feels it some too. Kevin is also a human, but
yeah.
but it,
I mean,
the,
I have to say very few things are working for me over Zoom. Like part of the whole the through line of this crisis in sort of my world is like, yay, and we're moving everything onto Zoom. And people are, and there's a certain sense of inevitability about everything moving online too, where people are like, well, they're gonna have to figure this out sooner or later, and of course things are going to go more online. And I kind of like, really? Like, do we have to? Like, that's not just because you have a technology doesn't mean you have to use it for everything. Like, it's great that we have it now. Like
yeah,
honestly, I believe that Zoom and Netflix are saving lives. Like had
right,
this panic hit in the 80s, had this pandemic hit in the 80s, not only would we have not had the information and the vaccines and the right social distancing practices and whatever, but people wouldn't have stayed in because they wouldn't have Netflix. Like I believe me, it's good. But the sort of sense that it's like a Whiggish, trend toward the digital, like, well, of course everything's becoming more. I mean, like a lot of that stuff. I'm very like I'm fascinated with technology and I love technology. It's a thing that I care about deeply, but also I hate most technologies,
yeah.
like lots of them. And I mean, it's I like to quote Anton Ego from Ratatouille, who's when they ask the food,
We
they
watched
where they
that movie again. Go on.
what's that?
We just watched that movie this week, actually.
Yeah.
So
Well, when they ask him, like when the guy what's the main character's name again?
uh,
When the protagonist, the one who has Remy on his head,
no,
I only remember Remy's the protagonist, he's the rat, but the guy who Remy sits on his head is,
yeah,
the putative protagonist. Anyway, of course it's really the rat's movie. But anyway, he's floundering for words and says, "Well, you're for someone who loves food, you're awfully thin." And Anton Ego says, "I don't. Oh, for someone who likes food, you're awfully thin." And Anton Ego says, "I don't like food. I love it. And if I
mm.
don't love it, I don't swallow."
Yeah,
Something along those lines. Anyway, and I mean, so that's kind of like me about technology. Like, I don't know. I care a lot about technology, which means I don't like most of it. And I find it really hard to
I'm
do a
making
lot
a
of these
note.
things
I want to come back to
online.
that conversation because I think Zoom and tech and the future is a good topic for us. So we said we were only going to talk for an hour today, and we've already gone
Yeah,
over.
yeah.
I think we should stay
Of
onto this
course we
and
have.
wrap up. I think we're mostly. I think
Yeah.
where I am right now is so that's here's my wrap up. Where I am right now is I had a come to Jesus moment about accepting my limits. And
Hmm.
I can't do everything. I had you know, thankfully, the mutual aid project, which I do think we should also come back to, we found some other people to partner with who are doing the pieces I was failing to do. So that is going along, which is reassuring. The mask situation, like there are now masks at Target and Gap, and even if they're crappy, at least
Hmm.
like the acuteness is
Yeah,
reduced. I don't feel like I have to spend 2 hours a day sewing masks anymore, which
yeah,
is an amazing relief getting my time back
yeah.
sewing,
I
but
am I am not competent to sew masks, but this is I would like to feature this mask made by my niece,
mm,
Philippa, that
very
she sent
nice.
me. Yeah.
And
Anyway.
when you say you're not competent to sew masks, I will just pause and point out that uh, that when people talk about like, oh, I feel helpless and there's nothing I can do, you're not in a crisis situation anymore, and at this point, it doesn't make sense for you to like be shipping masks out of your local area, but it doesn't
Ooh,
take very
maybe.
long. For anyone who's listening, it
Yeah.
a basic
Well, I
sewing
mean,
machine is about $60. It takes maybe an hour to learn enough to be able to sew a
mm,
mask,
sure.
and then you'll be good at it within 4 to 5 hours. So it's the investment of like half a day, and then
Mhm.
you too could be cranking out masks and relieving the pressure on some of the rest of us. So I will say it's less acute now than it was 2 months ago, but it may become acute again. I don't know. Hopefully,
Mhm.
the supply chain
Yeah.
issues will have been resolved at this point, although I'm hearing there's still need for scrub caps and whatever else. But I am kind of settling into summer work schedule, and I feel normal. I feel like essentially I'm back to mostly normal summer productivity, and um, like I don't like the phrase the new normal because this is
Mm,
still obviously not that.
hmm.
There's still a wildfire raging around me.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'm like, I've got my shelter set up, and it seems like it's okay, and I don't know. So I'm sort of hoping where I am right now is hoping this continues, hoping Illinois keeps sliding downwards. Maybe we'll get to where you are within the next 2 years. I hope so.
Hope so.
Well,
Two
you're laughing.
years.
Like I'm dead serious, right? So I don't. I mean, I think the from what I've read, the vaccine being ready by then is possible, but not guaranteed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
if we don't have a vaccine, I really don't trust America to get our
Mm.
under one.
Yeah.
I just don't. So
Yeah.
uh, the the
I
we'll
wonder what will I when I wonder on a timescale of like 2 years if you actually would see like legal challenges to the notions that state can't close their borders, for instance. Or you know what I mean? I wonder whether there'll be an evolution because 2 years is a long time to undergo this kind of
It is,
uh
right? Yeah, and 2 years is pretty far out. But like, even if you think one
yeah,
year is enough that you have to retool the entire education system, right?
yeah,
That's right,
yeah.
and that's super. Like at this point, it's really, really unclear to me what's going to happen in the fall in terms of the university is telling us that classes over 70 will be online, but many of the others will still be in person, and I'm like you're surely going to get legal challenges to that in a variety of ways,
Hmm.
right? And it's absolutely putting our students at increased risk. And if
Yeah.
we go back into the classroom and I get one of my students sick and they
Hmm.
die, I don't know
Hmm.
how I live with that, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
how is that okay? So
Yeah.
I don't know. I, yeah. And of course, it's more likely to go in the other direction since they're 20 and I'm almost 50, but
Mm.
that part doesn't worry me.
Because of your odd lack of fear of death.
Because yes, my
Well, I would like to go on record as saying that I'm not okay with only having another 10 years of Marianne. So you need to
it's a
push out your
fundamental
date.
solipsistic, whatever.
That's
So
interesting that that would be your solipsistic position. But anyway.
believe that you can die, right? Then why be worried about it, right?
You
So
see, I'm a solipsist who thinks I have a finite. My solipsism feels like a solipsism of finite duration.
well, but it almost just doesn't matter, right? Like I'm going to die at some point. I know that. At which point the universe ends, right? So whether it happens,
Right,
you know,
and that doesn't seem like a vast injustice to you. All right, well, this is another podcast. We should talk about
so
the end of all things.
like whether it's 60 or at 100, it's equally an injustice, right?
Let's
So
let's let's make a note. Solipsism and the end of all things. That's another episode.
I'm writing
All
down
right.
a note.
Do you want my summary?
Yes, do your summary. I'm done.
So yeah, I wonder what is my summary. So I mean, on some sense, my fear is sort of transmuted now to be less personal and more global. Like I mean, one thing I'm really uh, that I dwell on is like I mean, Switzerland's good now.
Mhm.
America is still a wildfire, but even worse is like you look at Russia, and there's a lot of places, or like India, where it's like they can't even they locked down India like overnight. They were like, okay, well, by the way, tomorrow you can't go out, and then like essentially like millions of people immediately left the cities to rush to walk to the countryside, right? I mean, there's the way this plays out in places that don't have the resources for the kind of social distancing and so on CDC wants us to, it's one thing for the WHO to say, keep 2 meters away. There's a lot of places that that's just impossible. So in a way, we just saw the beginning of this now. Like now it's hitting all the places that are least prepared. Um, it sort of started out as a disease of, other than China, it started out as a disease of the rich world. Well, and
Yeah.
Iran, but you know, and so that's kind of terrible static in the background. Um, and America, like, and the fact that, like, I don't know what it's going to look like. I'm sort of relieved that my daughter decided to go to school in Holland, which isn't quite Switzerland, but is in that direction. They've definitely gone over the hump. So there's a possibility that she will actually go to school in September, because wouldn't that be strange if she was here for another couple of years while she was theoretically going to school in America? Um, but yeah, so, and there's a way that there's something about um there's something monotonous. There's something about like an endless featureless plane. Like I sort of for a while was like, okay, well, I've got my little pandemic routine. Like I write in the garden, we play board games in the attic, and it does feel like, I mean, particularly WisCon, I think, was sort of an emotional hit where I'm like, okay, well, that's one going by, and then July. I'm not going in July either, and so there's a sense of it stretching out. Even though I can go out and go to the hairdresser, and who knows, at some point basketball will start up, but there's definitely a disconnect. Like there's a way in which it's not just that I go to America because I miss America, but I also kind of miss who I am in America. There's like another self that I'm in exile from. So that's weird. But yeah. But I am at the same time, there's this way in which I'm sort of like, as noted before, like compared to something like climate change or something that's more complicated and less short term, this is a kindergarten crisis. But nonetheless, I'm kind of glad, I'm kind of proud of humans that so many places, I mean, I know that a
Yeah.
lot of America is still struggling with this, but that if you look at that curve of the world, like, it could be so much worse. Like what the original, we didn't just spike all the way up to herd immunity. So there is some, you know, there is some there is some hope for the species. Like a lot of places weathered the crisis and didn't even have the kind of, I mean, New York is underwater with ICUs and everything, but there's a lot of places that, like, they didn't actually need all those beds that
Well,
they rushed to get.
New York could have been much, much worse than it
Yeah,
actually. Like
yeah,
we did a reasonable job. New Yorkers did a reasonable job
yeah,
of
yeah,
keeping their hospitals from being overwhelmed, right?
yeah,
So could have been much worse. So.
yeah. So many places humans manage to break their habits and get R under one. It can be done, and the rest of the places it can be done. I mean, particularly in places that have the resources to do that. It's a lot harder in places where.
Hearing what you're saying about things where you are actually is making me feel a little more hopeful. I think I've been feeling pretty blue about America and our chances of reopening and what's going to happen. But now I'm like, okay, there is an end point to this. Maybe
Yeah,
it's 6 months from now, maybe it's a year from now, maybe it's 2 years from now. But there's an end point, right? And
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
having trouble.
And it's a weird, long, slow, strange ramp down where things here aren't. I mean, lots of things are. There are lots of. I mean, you don't like the phrase, but there is a sort of a creeping new normal, right? Where it's sort of like, well, this is what the gym looks like now. Masks and constant spraying down of the machines and whatever. But yeah, it's an end as a process. So I don't know if it's an end point, but it's an end. It's an end state. It's a gradual um, recuperation.
All right.
And with that,
No, I think that's a good pausing point, stopping point. So, yeah, thanks. This was I don't know that we have a title for this, like how the pandemic affected us.
how the pandemic felt,
How
how
we're
the
doing
pandemic feels.
2 months into the pandemic. So, yeah, thanks. And hopefully, the next time we talk about this, it'll all be over. That would be great. So,
Well, that's that's you mean Sunday?
I'm thinking we're going to be talking about
Oh,
maybe
oh, yeah, I see what you
come
mean.
back to
Yes,
the topic. So, all right.
sure.
All right. So, thanks, guys. Talk to you soon. Bye.
All
We need
right,
to sign
bye,
off. Want to sign off. Bye.
bye.